welcome to Risk Roundup. What we humans have been doing all these years, artificial intelligence, in short referred to as AI, has begun to do some of it as well. Today, the artificial intelligence systems have started to create numerous works that bring the potential to generate enormous economic value by giving rise to entirely new products and services. This includes not only musical compositions or different kinds of writings, different reports and recipes and so on, but also algorithms and potentially patentable inventions. As a result, it is increasingly becoming essential for us to differentiate whether those intellectual property rights belong to the innovators that have developed the AI systems or algorithms in the first place, or whether the rights belong to the AI system that evolved and is now producing their own IP. The reality remains that we are struggling with the issue of non-human authorship and inventorship. To discuss whether we should recognize AI authorship and inventorship, I'm delighted to welcome Mark Montgomery to this roundup. Mark is the founder, chief executive officer, and chairman of the board of KYield Inc. He is the inventor of the now patented AI system that serves as the foundation for the KYield operating system, Modular System for optimizing knowledge yield in the digital workplace. Mark is also the inventor of the more recent patent pending, the synthetic genius machine. Welcome, Mark. We are so honored to have you on Risk Roundup.
Well, thank you very much for the invite. It's nice to be here with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. So as we begin to evaluate whether AI should be treated or AI system should be treated as any other machine or a legal entity with a right for ownership, it is important to understand and differentiate whether AI is a non-living or a living thing. So do you think AI is a living, should we consider AI as a whole another living species that we are creating, or is it just a machine?
Well, it isn't yet. And I don't see it in the foreseeable future, in my lifetime anyway. And so right off the bat, I think it's we need to protect the work of the people that are behind the algorithms that are developing it. However, it's certainly plausible that at some point in the not too distant future, that the especially in the biological systems that are where we're combining machines with biological systems and organic systems, that it will represent life. At some point, it will probably cross that threshold. I think it's premature for. I supported the agreement or the decision that we're not quite there yet. But yes, you can see it in the future at some point. It certainly has the capacity to do it. I realize that brings up all kinds of spiritual and religious and philosophical issues, but at some point, it probably will represent a new entity.
Yes, you are right. I mean, at some point we will come across that point where we will have to decide whether this is an entirely new species, because it is an intelligent species that we are creating. These machines that we have created so far, including computers, are still not in the same category. Here, algorithms are able to create another algorithms and their own language and all kinds of things. So it's going to be very complex. And actually, the conversation has already started across nations. France is, I believe, leading, ahead of us in deciding whether we should consider these as a legal entity, another living species with rights of its own, just like humans. So in France, I think that conversation is so far ahead, and there are ways that they are, able to differentiate how to go forward, with the AI creation. But the bigger question is that, when we say that, should AI be able to get those rights as a legal entity, the question is that is any algorithm or is any AI system requesting that kind of, recognition for their contribution, or is it behind the humans behind those systems that are interested in getting that recognition, those patents for their AI system and all. So that point is still, there, because who are who is representing, the AI system? Is it the human or AI itself? If we cannot, figure out that, we cannot decide whether this is a legal entity, because they should have a right on their own, and they should be able to represent on their own if they are requesting the rights of their own. Isn't it? Isn't that true?
Well, I think you bring up a kind of an interesting threshold, which is when the systems become aware enough to be able to complete the bureaucratic process of applying for a patent without any outside assistance, also aware of the need to protect its own interests. Those are some interesting sort of thresholds that probably should be included in an overall test to see whether or not I'm not when we're talking about this sort of thing, an entity that's certainly different than the Turing test, right? It's a much higher threshold and those kinds of rights, but with the rapid evolution of genetic algorithms and algorithms that can learn from inception without prior data installed, and just collect the information, it's certainly on the horizon, and you can see it coming down. I'm not really I haven't followed France that closely, so I'm probably not as aware as you are of what's going on over there. But yeah, it's certainly not too early to debate it and discuss it, right? Because
Yes.
those are going to be issues that we're confronted with.
Yes, absolutely. And you made a good point about the genetic algorithms, and especially when the AI systems start working in the legal sector and they start doing a lot of, work that lawyers do, they are going to develop that awareness that you just talked about, that once they become aware, then yes, we will have to address those issues. And once the AI systems start working in the legal sector more and more, and they start filing, all these patents and, the rights and all that, IP rights and patents and trade secrets and all that, then they are going to start thinking themselves that why we are creating this work on our own. This is something we have created, so we should file our own patent. So that day probably is not that far. Now, since AI has begun to infiltrate virtually all sectors, not just the legal sector and healthcare sector and all these other sectors, and every aspect of our human experience, when we visualize something as crucial as or something super important like this, when we start considering AI as a legal entity, what are the implications do you see happening for humans to have that understanding that AI is a living entity, its own legal entity, and it has its own patent protection and all that? Where do you think we will be focusing that time? What would be going through our minds that time?
Well, I think that probably the most important from an ethical perspective, that when we get to that point, will be, let's say, for example, when an independent agent is able to trounce attorneys in a Supreme Court argument, debate, let's say, similar to what they've already done with games, right? So that's technically, it's a very, very far more complex undertaking, because we know what the rules of the games are, and the legal discourse and the rules are far more complex and open-ended. So it's a much more difficult technical hurdle to overcome. And I think we're probably quite a ways from it, but we can certainly see the potential of that occurring. When that happens, and each sort of industry and society in general, then we probably need to, I think it's even beyond probably, we need then to look at it perhaps in terms of human rights, are going to be differentiated from purely machine or artificial species, as you call it, because the capabilities are different. So in that regard, from an intellectual standpoint, then we're probably going to need, in those areas where AI is, let's call it super intelligence by that point, is so vastly superior from an intelligence perspective than humans even for specific tasks like you brought up in the legal profession or others, then we probably need to view, and I hate to do this because it's somewhat depressing. We probably need to look at humans like we do other species, biological species, and provide extra protection for them. Like cruelty to animals, for example. And so we probably will need at that point extra protections for humans, and not just in legal rights, but also at that point we'll probably need to address the economic disparities, because superintelligence will introduce that. Now, I have not been one raising the alarm about in the near term, the displacement of millions of jobs, because I see, from my perspective, a vast opportunity to create jobs still. And so I see new industries and all kinds of space exploration and healthcare, new models in healthcare. It will displace people, but there's definitely millions and millions and millions of new jobs. But when we have superintelligence, as many of my peers have pointed out, that it really does change the game, and it changes the sort of the ethical, the whole framework of ethics and how we deal with humans. Overall, I think it will be beneficial, because superintelligence, at least since we don't have it yet, we're still theoretically, but with growing evidence, let's say, that we'll be able to do things like you and I share an interest in reducing existential risk for our species and for the planet. I'm of the view that we may need superintelligence to survive as a species, and for our planet to survive, and to be able to live in space comfortably and safely. So that brings a sort of a higher level ethical consideration, in that, which choose your poison, right? So to speak. And that is pretty consistent with the evolution of our species to this point. We would not be able to keep however many, what are we at, 9 billion, close to 9 billion people alive every day, if we did not have automation and machines moving supply chains and assisting in agriculture alive, in medical. It would be impossible. And I don't think the majority of people that are debating this issue and worried about jobs, just since we're on the topic, an excellent example that I use all the time. We've had 3 major catastrophes in 20 years that have affected the U.S. 2 of them occurred here that were preventable. But our institutions were not able to prevent them for different reasons, 9/11 being the first one. And I'm defining this formally as 10 trillion or more in economic damage, or large numbers of lives lost, which is how it's categorized by researchers in catastrophes. So we failed in 9/11 to prevent it. That was the easiest one to prevent. We had the names of the people on the plane in advance, sitting on a server in the FBI, and they were not able to act just for sort of process reasons, technical reasons, bureaucratic, cultural reasons, sharing the information. Then we had the financial crisis, which was absolutely preventable, a lot more complex to do it from a technical perspective, but it was preventable. And now we have a global pandemic. These have all, this has all been warned for decades. These sort of events are known. And meanwhile, our economy and our society erodes each time. Our debt increases, the risk goes up. And so that's why, if you look at just sort of the trajectory that we're on, if we don't tap into these really advanced systems to prevent major systemic crises, catastrophic risks, it unfortunately looks more and more, just based on the evidence, that we may not survive. And
Yes,
that's really what it comes down to.
yes, I hear you, and you made some very, very good points about where we are heading, and that makes me, think even deeper. That if we hypothetically, let's say, France has started considering, that yes, we will go down the road where we will, consider these as its own legal entity, and if we go down that path, United States has not, taken that stand, and we are not recognizing that. But if we go this path, and if we recognize artificial intelligence as entirely another living species, and a legal entity of its own, then I believe we are creating a huge risk for human species. And the reason I, say this is, as soon as AI start thinking that they are another intelligent species, they are going to start thinking that yes, these humans are not intelligent at all. We can control them. So
Right.
is that a wise thing to do for us, to give them the legal identity, or we create a scenario, a framework in which we consider them as part of our virtual brain? A human octopus has so many brains in all its tentacles, So
Right.
why should we human species, recognize or go the path where we create an intelligence, a brain, human, virtual brain sort of, and tell that it's only own species? Why don't we just incorporate that virtual brain as part of human identity and make it as a part of our human species? So we we can sort of prevent that conflict that is bound to emerge, in the coming years, if we give that freedom to AI to think that it's a whole another species. If we let the AI start thinking that it is just a virtual brain for humans and it is part of human species, then they are going to be loyal to us. They will start, thinking in terms of that we are a virtual brain for humans and we are a human species. So I believe that, it is a mistake to go ahead and start recognizing AI system as a legal entity. We should just consider AI as a virtual brain of human species.
Well, that's how we approach it with our work. We had governance designed in from the beginning to enhance the work of humans, and it's much more as a team effort for augmentation, right? And so, that's in the ethical part of it is built in from the very beginning in our original system. The Kyield OS was designed that way. And so I agree with you. I mean, I think that really from a legal perspective, of course, we'll have to bring in the legal experts into the discussion. But I think it will be a different when it gets to the point where now remember, humans are creating every single one of these algorithms, right? Even if they're algorithms that recreate new algorithms, the original version was created by a human, and all these machines were created by humans and still are. And for the most part, the automatic learning that's taking place now, we're seeing that quite a few researchers that are focused on that. And it's evolving rapidly, and eventually they will get to the point where it will be able to surpass. And already in the early sort of tests of this, indications are that it is able to, that some of these algorithms are able to surpass traditional algorithms, or let's call them, manually created algorithms versus automatically created algorithms, because that's really where we're at right now. So yeah, I agree with you. From an ethical perspective, I think that's the right approach. So I think eventually when we get to that point where we have algorithms that are able to do that. Now as far as the risk that you're talking about, I don't see much of a problem with that. At least in our work, it's pretty easy to restrict algorithms from deciding on their own. So we have, ours is a rules-based system, right? And it's semi-automated, so that in natural language, so that the chief security officer, the CEO, the CFO of a large organization, they can actually use our natural language to create those rules that restrict the algorithms or the AI system from doing that. And frankly, that's the only way you can comply with regulations. You can't have
Yes.
whether it's a human or a machine going out and deciding on their own what rules are valid and what rules are not. One that's commonly used is murder, but you could use any of our laws and just say, well, if we're going to leave it up to the individual, machine or human, to determine what they have to comply with, then you have complete breakdown of society. And it's actually somewhat worse with machines when you get into the enterprise level. The risk factor is so high that it's not something that you mess with. But fortunately, it's pretty easy to avoid. And I don't even quite understand what some of the early sort of a hysteria about it that was created even by AI scientists because it questions their own ability, because the rules-based systems, we've just heard about this, by the way, in the last 2 or 3 years in the leading AI labs that are famous, where they're finally realizing, well, oh my goodness, you need rules-based systems in this. And that came from the pushback, of course, with the ethics and involved with the online networks and all the problems that are having. And they didn't have them, right? They just had individual algorithms doing certain things. And they really didn't plan these networks as a real AI system with governance from the beginning. And that's where we really get into trouble. It's like any other thing that you do. If ethics are not embedded in what you're doing from the beginning, in your architecture and your design, think of the U.S. Constitution, for example, or any other. It need not be automated systems. But if you don't have that planned in from the beginning, you're going to run into trouble. And then by then, it's very difficult from a technical and engineering perspective to re-architect your systems so that it's effective. And I think that's really kind of where we're at now, is that people went after the money, they went after the low-hanging fruit, they didn't spend the time and research and work on it. And some of them were just amazingly successful in terms of of wealth creation and especially social networking. But we're also seeing the bigger problems. And now they're going to be looks like increasingly they're going to be micromanaged by Congress. And boy, if that's not a nightmare from a technical architecture perspective, trying to communicate to people that don't have the technical ability, right? Yes, and say, yes, why can we do this? Why can't we do this? And they're going to find that world a lot more stressful than the world that they've been playing in for the past 10 years. So
yes, I agree with you. Those are very complex challenges we are dealing with and we will be dealing with as we go forward. But I'm thinking about it. This is not just about AI. We are on the verge of creating, using synthetic biology. We are going to, we have already started creating, entire or microorganism from the scratch. It is already happening. In the coming years, we'll be able to create, a little more complex, biological organism. And so, as we go forward, with the advanced tools and technologies, we will have much bigger capacities. So then, we are already creating the live organisms, from scratch. We will be able to create, probably animals from scratch, probably some superhuman from scratch. So it's not just about AI. We are creating many different, we are advancing in many different directions and many different species we are creating. So these are questions we have to start thinking when we create. For instance, right now we are going through a pandemic, and as I was thinking about it, how to make this the very last pandemic. And I have been thinking about this. I have a background in microbiology, and I have enough understanding to know that there are trillions of microorganisms that live inside us, on us, and around us. So when most over the years, we have been living in symbiosis, with most of these microorganisms. In fact, our human genome is more than 50% of our genome comes from viruses. That has been documented. Now, every time virus infection happens, pandemic happens, pandemics are portal to evolution, sort of, every
Right.
time, we get new traits because of that, new genes because of that, and new DNA, portion of, our genome because of that. Now, when we have all these microorganisms that we are hearing that, this particular virus was used to be in a bat, now it jumped species and it came to human. What are the drivers that, made the virus jump from the bat to come to humans? What is happening in our human ecosystem? And when I say human ecosystem, it is cyberspace, aquaspace, geospace, and space. And all these are interconnected because of this cyberspace that we have created, man-made. So in the digital space that we have created, the use of this electromagnetic spectrum, the man-made electromagnetic spectrum, is polarizing. The natural electromagnetic spectrum that we all have been exposed to, it is not polarizing. So there are many, many changes happening in our ecosystem that probably are, creating some complex scenarios that we are still, trying to understand. That could be one of the reasons why we are witnessing this pandemic, COVID-19, that we are all, facing right now. But still, there is a lot that we have to study. This is just a, assumption that there are changes that has happened in our human ecosystem that has shifted our ecology, and that is the reason, we are seeing this shift coming. So the reason I'm talking about this is that in the coming years, it is possible that, again, this is a IP idea that I'm, talking out loud, that, if someone, what I'm going to talk right now.
Don't disclose anything. Don't disclose anything. We don't want anybody doing a patent application later today and stealing your ideas. So.
Yeah, this is one of those very big ideas. So I think let's go ahead and talk about this after, this recording, because I don't want to give out my idea.
Yeah.
The previous roundups, I have given out so many ideas, because as I do these roundups, ideas come to me and I talk about it without realizing the legal implications. Now, my whole purpose is to solve the complex problems facing human species, but we also want to be mindful about, the protection. So I will give you the idea, I will talk about it after the roundup is done. But where I'm going is that we will be creating new and new ways of protecting our species. And every time we do that, are we going to give that individual, legal entity rights to any of those things that we create, whether it's an AI system or whether it's a biosystem? So where I'm going is that this AI system is not just one, thing we are talking about that we are creating. We are on the verge of creating many, many new,
right.
many, many new, living, non-living things, that would be working for us, for our betterment. And there is a boundaries, what we understood non-living over the years. Now, there is a research emerging that actually, there is nothing like non-living, everything is living, and the whole universe is a living organism. So then where the research is going, it's very fascinating. When we are truly able to understand the basics of that entire living organism, the universe as a living organism, then we are going to understand all these, in an entirely different way. So we have to understand the universe first to be able to understand all these bits and pieces that we are creating, and then decide what kind of rights we want to give that. So that is when the reason I'm talking about this with you is that you are an innovator. You create all these new synthetic IPs and all these new machines, and that has futuristic value. How do you decide what you want to reveal? How would you like to frame as an innovator what you would like to see your innovations? Because when you give, let's say, a code of the algorithm to one of your employees, and you tell the employee to enhance it, to work on it, and to make it better. So the employee works on it, makes it better, comes up with new ideas and makes it an entirely something new. What goes in your mind as you give your work to your employee or you give work to that algorithm? How do you differentiate that, when you try to strengthen what you have already started working on, and where would you like to see that those protection mechanisms with surrounding the employee or surrounding the algorithm?
Yeah. Well, we we anticipated some of this years ago, and so one of the things that we included in the Kyield OS from very early on, actually, is from about 2000, 2002. Someone in that era is a knowledge currency. So this is long before Bitcoin and the rest of it. But with the governance in the system that we had, in the augmentation of AI and the human workflow, we also have some structural problems with human IP, right? We have some very serious problems in protection of human-generated IP. And there's some real problems with the patenting system and the patent process. We don't have time to get into all that today, but just with the market share dominance, the erosion of rights, you can see that clearly on who benefits from it. We already have semi-automated processes in large corporations to help employees generate patents. So we have these sort of patent manufacturing processes that are occurring in those that are generating the most patents, sort of playing the system. So if you look at the combination of factors of what AI can do to enhance, let's say, accelerate R&D, and that's been an area that I've been focused on for a long time. It's one of actually from the very beginning, the motivation on this was actually my brother was diagnosed with ALS. And so that had a powerful impact on me. And of course, what I found was one of the most complex diseases. And at the time, 23 years ago, we were a long way from being able to even understand the disease, much less come up with any sort of effective cure or a therapy. So, but to your point, the knowledge currency is one way you could deal with that. So whoever owns the machine would then presumably have the financial rights, or would be, let's say you had a knowledge currency and you had a new function, let's call it, that the system creates on its own, or in conjunction, more likely in the foreseeable future, will be with a team, in a working team of humans, and who will have AI assistants that will help accelerate. And they may or may not work for the same corporation. So then you get into some sort of interesting things on collaboration, and the knowledge currency can help with that. But when you can attribute the work that the individual does and protect the actual work products of the individual, and track it and see what the contributions of the machine is, or their algorithm, and the folks that were, let's say you have a collaboration for pharmaceuticals working on something like a COVID vaccine, and they're collaborating. And ideally, we wouldn't have these large corporate R&D systems. We would, when we have a situation, and finally, because of the pandemic, we have seen this. We've seen some of those fiefdoms, let's call it, break down, and people are collaborating for the common good, right? Which is great to see. But we need that in everything that we do, right? We need it to cure cancer. We need that for space travel. We need that for prevention of major catastrophes. That would be ideal. And so that was the purpose of having a knowledge currency. But of course, being able to do that and attribute that value, like with your discussion here, let's say you come up with ideas. Now, this is for the public, so you couldn't do it. But then we can use actually contractual law. So let's say you and I were doing this privately. We're collaborating. But in advance, we agree in a simple agreement, a contract, that we've demonstrated that the algorithm can provide a rational valuation of what you contribute and what I contribute to the conversation, and that way it would protect you. So in a collaborative environment, let's say you had 12 different entities, some of them were independent consultants and some were major corporations. That way you would limit reduce the obstacles to innovation, which are, I don't think most people realize just how problematic that is. That when we get just bogged down into lengthy negotiations on protecting trade secrets, for example, in collaborations in some of these areas that we need. And then the other side doesn't work either, where you have complete open source, where the people, we tested this in our lab in GWIN, Global Web Interactive Network, in the late 90s, where we had open innovation. And we had individuals contributing in that network that could only benefit. There were only a few corporations that had the market share that could benefit from those ideas, right? Just because they had the market share, they had the distribution, no one else. So we had the ideas coming from these individuals, but billions of dollars were made by the corporations. And the people that came up with the ideas got nothing, because we didn't have that sort of infrastructure in place to protect them. And so in a network environment, it's actually quite doable. Now, there are several companies I'm aware of that are working on similar aspects. So, but to your other point I wanted to get to, because I think that's kind of more important, more broadly for the species, is that I think you're absolutely correct. One of the most common things that I discuss with senior teams, whether they're in corporation or whether national security, doesn't really matter, is that the complexity is increasing so fast, and the amount of information that's available is increasing so fast, that we don't even realize how little of it that we're capturing. And so that is really the highest value of AI systems in looking to the foreseeable future, whether it's a corporation or whether it's a nation, doesn't really matter. You talk to the DOD, whoever it is. The generals are not even aware of the DOD. They may be aware of their ignorance, they may be aware of some blind spots, but they're not, none of us have the capacity, because the interactions are so vast. None of us have the capacity to, because we're not even aware of what those interactions are, right? We're not tracking all those interactions. We didn't know COVID was happening in China until we did. And so we knew that the possibility existed. It's been warned about for years. We knew we had global air travel so that these viruses could travel immediately around the world. But we still don't have the infrastructure in place for early warning systems. So those low-hanging fruit with AI systems is how we survive as a species, right? We get those early warning systems in place, just like we have with tsunamis, like we have with hurricanes, and that's how we take care of the pandemic situation. We automate a big part of it. And then our understanding...
Sorry, let me interrupt you.
No,
you made an excellent point that what problems to focus on, where the technology solution should be developed. That is so important. And I think we, as an innovators, we failed in that, because with the AI systems that we have now, with the Internet of Things sensors we have available now, and the technology, biosensors that were available, it was very doable to develop system to identify any biological outbreak, but we failed. So the problem is that we've
been calling for it for decades.
The right problems.
Yeah, I mean, for the early warning system for pandemics, I first called for it, I think, in 2000, and I wasn't the first. There have been people, and our capabilities then were primitive compared to today. Today, it's foolish not to look how many. This is going to be what, a $20 trillion event by the time it's over. 10, 15, 20 trillion, it's ridiculous. Tens of millions of people unemployed around the world. We can't even know, there's some real problems in terms of risk. Will it be a trigger or one of many triggers that creates a war that could eventually evolve into a world war? I mean, you do not want to fool around with these things. Let's just be brutally honest here. We have the capabilities. We need to get this done. And so those, and there are many areas. I mean, the same for on the corporate level, they have there's a lot that corporations can do to limit existential risk. I know you've worked a lot in cybersecurity. I mean, that's a very good example of how the governments have approached it. It's kind of a crude way of describing it, but we have butts in seats. So we hire more people and train them in cybersecurity when we know that the problem is an engineering problem. It was faulty from the very beginning. And finally, now we have, for example, the Energy Department working on a potential solution for that. But yeah, we need to separate out our ideology from the hardcore reality and the physics-driven reality of what these risks are, because most of these solutions in prevention are buried in physics. You cannot physically prevent a pandemic unless you have that type of early warning system in place. So, I mean, that's pretty simple from a policy perspective. Of course, we get into politics and all the rest of it, and that's why we can't do it, but we simply must do these things. We must.
We must. And that is, I mean, yes, you are right that, the political ideology has become such a dividing, factor in United States especially. And, for all the countries to work together, it seems it's impossible right now. Everyone, has their own agenda. So then who is going to look after, the challenges facing human species? So I think innovators, entrepreneurs will have to take this responsibility on themselves and come up with new ways of doing things, because now we are all an interconnected society. If we decide that we want to create this, pandemic prevention tool or, something that would identify the outbreak, then, it should not be difficult for us to do that, because everybody is interconnected and everybody would understand the need for this. So while we would love governments to, be the leading, voice in this and, come up with a support system that allows us to do that. But if we do not find that support system, then we have to do this ourselves. So these are very, you made excellent points about it. And we have to come up with a new way of thinking. We have to have these, big visions about where we are facing challenges. And as we see right now, the youth, the young generation is really frustrated. A lot of them, just graduated.
I don't blame them. I do not blame them.
Yes, and they have a lot of concerns about their future. So we have to, have that dialogue. We have to open the discussion. We have to create the open forums and see where we can go as a species, with or without, government's help, to see what we can do effectively, collectively, so that, we can prevent the future risk for not only our species, but our next generation, because they are really terrified right now. That they are scared, what is coming their way.
Oh, just from the economic perspective, their rights are getting trampled. So they have every right to be. But that's being frustrated is a very different thing than coming up with viable solutions, right? And so that's where experience and decades of experience working on these things can help. But one thing, just to the point that you just made. I think NASA with SpaceX is a pretty good example where the catastrophic events that NASA had that were significantly caused by bureaucracy and internal political issues. There's been many, we study these events as they occur, and when there's public information, sometimes private information. And that's the norm, right? Why we didn't prevent this thing from happening when there's always some expert, that's what they're hired to do. They warned about it. They knew it was a risk. And for whatever reason, and there are many different reasons, the institution was not able to act on it, right? So what NASA, in their wisdom, admitted, which I think is great with SpaceX, was that, look, we are not maybe the best innovators in the world like we've been talking about for decades because of our political baggage and because of our bureaucratic issues that we deal with. So they recognize that they perhaps were not. On the other hand, they also recognize that they have a lot of strengths, a lot of great science, and they have access to federal government funding. And so as a partner, it made sense. So here we have these reusable rockets now for spaceflight, which is going to dramatically accelerate the whole space industry. But if you look at industry after industry, I think that's a pretty good model, even though it's very early, right, and fairly primitive for, and maybe not, hopefully just one company, but to partner with others. Our government agencies have a very difficult time partnering, especially with smaller, innovative companies. And that really is the mindset that you need, is that you need, and they need the freedom to do it. So some legislation would help for sure. Some political leadership would help for sure. But I think internally in the culture, when you see this, the DoD has been attempting this for the past few years. You can see the recognition that internally, and that debate has been taking place where they recognize that they're not the best at many things and that they need to go out and partner with others to do it. So I think that is a pretty good way forward in terms of the public-private partnerships in addressing these things. Now, internationally, it's a different story. We talk about early warning systems with pandemics. We can't force China or any other nation, sovereign nation, to do it. However, there's an awful lot that we can do, even from a national level, that we should be doing that we aren't. Yes. And it's actually indefensible that we don't have early warning systems for pandemics in place, because there's all types of experts that have been warning about it for years and years and years. And now this is, it's somewhat alarming, but this is the truth. And I'm not an alarmist by any stretch, but this is a very minor virus from a fatality rate. We're very fortunate in that respect, because the worst case scenarios are off the charts, right? What if it was one that had a 50% fatality rate? I mean, my goodness, we're talking about a complete thermonuclear war type scenario in terms of, and so to even risk that, to even invite it, so to speak, and that's not even to say about biological intentional warfare, which we have the capability to do that now. Other countries, hopefully they won't, but that's also a possibility. So whether it's natural, whether it's biological, intentional, this is not something that you fool with. And it seems to me that's the highest responsibility of leaders, whether it's a private sector, public sector, to prevent these existential catastrophic events. And so, yeah, we're totally in agreement that we need, and governments are failing. I mean, there is just no question about it. Governments have failed to prevent these types of catastrophes for decades now. So we can't rely entirely on governments for solutions.
Agreed. You made excellent point, and we have the common thought leadership on that. What you are saying, I completely agree. So having said that, you made some excellent points, and we have to take control of our lives and our future for our species. And our, of course, when I started thinking, is I'm a mother of 3 kids. So for me, it is super important that I leave behind, when my time comes, I leave behind, future that my kids, feel secure, that they don't have to worry about whether the planet is going to survive, or whether, they can get out of the house, or, all kinds of, challenges that we are facing right now. So as we collectively, when we all come together, there is no problem that we cannot solve. We have enough brain power. And you're right that, right now, we probably will have to focus on us as a nation, because, getting collaboration, cooperation from other countries is going to be challenging. It is a very turbulent time. So let's focus as, United States, and let's try to solve all these problems for our country. And then, we can always translate that to other nations and, protect the future of the entire species. So what would you like to tell our global viewers and listeners about your initiatives? Sorry about that. And efforts.
Well, the only thing that I would say is that these sorts of issues that we're talking about now in terms of early warning systems are doable today. We have the engineering capabilities, we have the systems, we have the talent, we have essentially all you need is the right partners to do it. And so there's financial issues, obviously, but the most important issue is the physics. You can't, in terms of preventing very specific types of events, as you know, with a biology background, I mean, you need to have the data from the source. And that's one of the problems with this COVID situation, is that the interpretation of data is sort of craziness. It needs to be structured in advance. You need to agree on certain things in advance of the data structure in the system. So you're collecting certain things that will enable an effective early warning system. So that knowledge exists. It's only when we get into the political realm where we have problems. And in public health, for a lot of reasons, it's much more political than in other realms. I've talked to peers and friends in infectious disease and other areas where they have a pretty good pulse on why that is the case. I mean, what is scarier to humans in the political world than an invisible killer that spreads very easily? So it immediately has these political ramifications, and of course, then it threatens politicians, and they all have to sort of outprove the other that they're doing a better job. It's kind of ridiculous, really. So we have the systems in place. We just need partners. Personally, I think it would be best. There are certain things that nations should do and government should partner, but it's also there. I think it would be best on an international level. So even if you're not getting the majority of countries, or let's say you're not getting all of the countries, there's no reason why, for example, countries that already have security agreements in place could not collaborate on an early warning pandemic. And that way, when you have an early warning system in place for pandemics, and you have, let's say, you're along, let's call it NATO, just for the sake of example. It wouldn't be restricted to NATO, but just as an example, it is a national security issue. It's an economic security issue. It's a public health. There's a lot of other things, but those relationships already exist, and they're already doing humanitarian work. So this is really not that far outside of their realm. They can understand that and do it. And the nice thing about that is worst case scenario, you do install an early warning system for those nations. Then at least if the worst case scenario occurs and it happens somewhere else, and you had those early warning systems, at least you then could close off your countries. If we do have a 50% fatality rate or even higher, some of them are, not to scare people, but some of them are in the 90s, and some of them are actually 100% fatality rate. My goodness. Fortunately, they're not very infectious, but it is theoretically possible. And in some respects, it's only a matter of time before we get a 50%. So we need to get those things in place. It's probably better to do it internationally. Then I would think, hopefully, if you watch these patterns, right, that if you had, let's say, NATO countries, and you had, let's say, France and Germany and the United States and a few others, the UK, and working on it, and you demonstrated the effectiveness of it, and there are ways you can test it, then it would hopefully be easier to include other nations. And then you would have the social and economic pressure on others that might not want to join. And of course, there's allies in Asia too. So it wouldn't be just NATO. You would get as much of the world as you could for the protection of all. And then also, if you close down the other economies, then at least you would have your economies wouldn't collapse, because you would be able to keep those trade and travel available. So that seems to me a common sense approach to this, with a way forward. The problem, of course, is that the contracting system in the U.S. government is such that it's unfortunate, but it's rare to have the best systems be procured. Again, we get into the politics and protectionists. A lot of times the organizations are afraid of accountability. They want to build it themselves. You run into problems. So the funders, there's problems with funding. So in that international sort of, it probably is best in partnership with some foundations, some, that is not necessarily, perhaps the UN would be a partner, but personally, I'm against having any sort of formal government control it, just because, as you say, the international community is not functioning very well right now. We don't seem to be able to get these things done. And we do some bilateral things pretty well. We do, groups, but we just are not doing a very good job. If we had been, we would not be having these major catastrophes. So That is sort of my warning about it. And from our perspective, as one company, we're happy to do what we can and throw our reduce if there's patents involved, we could reduce that to almost nothing from a financial perspective. So it's not IP is not holding it up from our perspective. It's just getting those types of partnerships structured. So if you or any of the listeners, anybody else is interested in that, in a position to be able to do it, we'd love to be able to. We are having those discussions with others. We just haven't found the right partners yet. So
yes, no, thank you so much. You made an excellent point that the priority should be developing the early warning systems, and I hope we can do it in our country, and then I hope that we can have other countries join our efforts so that we can collectively protect the future of our species. So thank you so much, Mark, for participating in this roundup today.
Appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. We appreciate your thoughtful insight on the complex challenges, emerging in front of us. For our species and our global viewers and listeners will benefit tremendously from the information you provided today. And as a result, the Risk Roundup Dialogue has been of service, and we thank you for that. So Risk Group is a strategic security risk research platform and community. Through the Risk Roundup initiative, Risk Group and I are on a mission to talk with 1 billion people, innovators, scientists, entrepreneurs, futurists, technologists, policymakers to decision makers. The reason behind this effort through the Risk Roundup initiative is to research, review, rate, and report strategic security risk facing humanity. The collective intelligence effort is essential to understand where we need to focus for our collective security and what destructive forces we need to be mindful about. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Until next time, I'm Jayshree, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time.